Thank you, everyone, for attending here in person, and for those of you who are online, listening online. Also, thank you for tuning into this one. This is the OII's 25th anniversary public lecture. Now, the speaker for the lecture, we initially planned this roughly, oh, I don't know, 5 or 6 months ago. We went into the SET meeting, myself, the director, deputy director, and whatnot, and we were like, who should we get? And multiple of us almost instantly were like, do you think we can get Dana Boyd? And I was like, well, I happen to know Dana. I was her first academic visitor at Microsoft Research many moons ago. So I made an email, and I'm very gracious that it was responded to. Very grateful for that. And so she has decided to join us this evening to give us a sense of her new work. So as it's suggested here, she is going to weave through internet past, present, and future, and shed light on the good, the bad, and the ugly, so that we can leverage our knowledge of what happened and what is happening still, as we might pursue a more just and maybe a more generous future for all of us as networked and connected people. Now, Dana herself is currently the Jerry Gay Professor of Communication at Cornell University. She founded the Research Institute Data and Society, where she still currently serves as an advisor. Now, her research focuses on the intersection of technology and society, with an eye towards structural inequalities and how they shape and are shaped by socio-technical systems. And I really appreciate that sense of structure. It's not about naming names, but about understanding how this world fits or doesn't fit together, and when it does. She's got a new upcoming book as well, and I've already heard some people talking about how the book, it's complicated, really was just spoke to them, and how meaningful it was to them. Even keen to ask questions about that and stuff. So I'm really keen to also hear where the next book is going. This one, Data Are Made, Not Found: A Story of Politics, Power, and the Civil Servants Who Saved the U.S. Census. So it's an ethnography of the U.S. Census Bureau, Jenga politics, as it's called. I love that phrase. Sort of just take the one last piece out and everything falls down. And the struggle to make democracies data. She's also conducted research on media manipulation, privacy practices, social media, and teen culture. Myself, of course, I think a lot would know here, really know her as a kind of pivotal figure in this notion of collapsed context and the challenges of identity online, of course, often related to teens, internet safety, and identity. So now, before we get this show on the road, just a couple bits of housekeeping here. The first one is, for your awareness, the event is being recorded, and it will be posted on our website following the event. The presentation is going to run about 30 to 40 minutes, and is followed by a discussion at the end. So you're welcome to ask questions for a Q&A. If you're joining us online, you can put your questions into the Q&A box, and we'll read some of those out, what we can, at the end. I'll be here moderating those questions. After the talk, we invite you to join us in the foyer out there for a drinks reception. Now, here's a really important one. There's no planned fire drills, so if the fire alarm sounds during the event, please head out to your nearest exit, either behind you or to my right over here. And if you need anything throughout the evening, you can please speak to Ellen. Ellen's right here, and she can help sort that out. Or Emma, the one at the desk who signed us in. I don't know if I see Emma here, but she's probably still at the desk. So that's just the housekeeping. Just want to make sure everyone's safe and sound for this, but ultimately we're really here, to hear about Dana. And to hear about her new work. So thank you, Dana. And I would hope everyone can help me in welcoming Dana to the stage. The show is yours.
It's a true delight to be here. It's also pretty funny because, Bernie was like, hey, we're celebrating our 25th anniversary. You want to come? And I'm like, yes, 25 years. I also was here at the 10th anniversary, which is making me feel a little old, but I appreciate it nonetheless. And it's a delight to be able to share research with you. I'm not actually talking about my book at all, but if anybody's curious, we can totally go there. My goal today is, as Bernie mentioned, to go through some pasts, some presents, and some futures. So I'm going to mix a bunch of different things in order to sort of take you on a little tour with me. And in that tour, one of the things you're going to get is some new data, which is really fun. So bear with me in the imperfections of sharing that new data. All right. So the internet that I first encountered, personally, me, was a very social internet. My brother had connected his computer to the phone line to download information because he was enjoying programming, and I had no idea what he was doing, but he was using up the phone line, and I had feelings about this. And then he showed me Usenet, and I was like, oh, the internet is made of people. And all of a sudden, things looked a lot more interesting to me. And my understanding of the economics of the internet at that time was pretty much curtailed down to the fact that we at 1 month got a $700 phone bill, which resulted in getting into a lot of trouble, right? An obscene amount of trouble. And after we finished being grounded, which lasted a while, my brother and I figured out a bunch of other ways to get access to the internet, all of which were illegal. And so one of the things that was really interesting to all of us is like, this was a moment not about money, not about power and politics. This was about the feelings and desires to connect. Now, as an academic, I would learn a lot about the military history of the internet. But as a teenager in the 90s, the only thing I knew about the military and the internet was my ability to talk to all sorts of queer and trans soldiers, mostly stationed in the Middle East, which was part of my coming of age story and making sense of who I was. And so the idea that this was a military technology was like, what are you talking about? It was a military technology in the very interpersonal ways. Now, by the time I started working in the tech industry in the late 90s, the dot-com boom was fully underway, and there was no way to avoid the financial logics that oozed through the valley. And then the bubble burst. And when the bubble burst, people claimed that there was no money to be made on the internet. Pretty funny to think about now. And the finance people, who we all mocked for living in the marina and other places in San Francisco, left the valley. And it was like a celebration. It was a cheer, right? Because all of us imagined we could go back to product and the idea of connecting people. And wouldn't that be great? And of course, little did we know what all was coming. So the teenagers that I started to study when I was paying attention to them, most notably between 2004 and 2012, were just as oblivious to the political economic layers of the internet as I was as a teenager. And as their adoption expanded and the internet became mainstream, the teenagers' orientation of the early days was really focused on connecting. They were also acting as digital flaneurs, right? They were walking the digital streets to see and be seen. There was all sorts of identity presentations and social connection, and they didn't really think much about how the environment around them was constructed. And so even though I, by that point, was acutely aware of how money was feeding into the tech industry, I was really interested in how teenagers were going to teenage, right? My generation enjoyed the very commercial mall as a place that we could take ownership of and reclaim to be as social purposes, and they were doing the same. And I was really curious about how they approached this from their own internal logics. Now, malls and shitified, even before social media did, and teens left the malls long ago, but it's not quite what happened to social media. The story of social media is different than the story of the mall, because social media's shitification actually coincide with a form of extraction, a slow, and extractive dynamic. And the very practice of what social media was changed. Beneath everybody's attention, it just changed. It just evolved slowly into the situation we have today. Today's teenagers, and perhaps many of you in this room, do not remember or know the social media tools that I studied or helped build. They cannot imagine an era of social media where you primarily saw content by people you chose to follow. You can't imagine a social media that was not shaped by an infinite scroll or creepy algorithms that leave you wondering what the heck is going on. No one can imagine a social media where managing scale and negotiating visibility was just not that big of a deal. right? These are all things we know now, but within the local context of then, they were not part of the culture. The social media that I studied for over a decade no longer exists. That is not, we can talk about the brands, we can talk about the names, but what I studied is no longer with us. The platforms that we now call social media can be better described as parasocial media. I used to think, when I was studying teens, of this as a virtual mall, right? The digital flaneur, the idea of being around, but that's the wrong metaphor for today. If you need to talk to old people like me, a better metaphor is MTV, right? Instagram and TikTok are delightful, both for the possibility of accessing fame and for the currency of being able to understand cultural references. And the interesting thing is, just like MTV, you can watch it or not watch it, but somehow the kinds of cultural references that are born in those environments ooze out. And we can sit there going 6'7", 6'7", and know what we're talking about, even though that's insane, because most of us actually weren't part of that conversation at the time it was happening. But it means that the cultural production is bending towards a form of influencer. And that form of consumption that we're dealing with is reverting back to a form of gatekeeping. This was something that was really common sense in TV and other media cultures. So what does it look like today? How do we make sense of that? Technologically mediated sociality absolutely exists, but it primarily takes place in text messaging and in group chats. Of course, one of the things that's sort of painful to me right now is that everybody thinks that it's a wise idea to block under 16s from social media. And my objection to this is not what people would think it is. My objection to this is that you have just advertised a tool that might be cool. I'm like, don't do that, right? Because what happens is when teenagers get blocked from something, they're like, ooh. Because honestly, for most young people, social media has been dead for a while. What's funny is to watch how they're getting creative to all these blocks and different ways of being. Never in my wildest imagination did I conceive of a world in which Google Docs would be the dominant chat room of young people. That's insane, right? But it turns out that passing notes never ended. It just took on different forms. And if you have a lot of teenagers together in one space, aka school, it turns out they're going to find ways to talk. And Google Docs is pretty entertaining. Now, there are still places in the interstices of the internet where people also still gather around shared interests. And if we're looking at raw numbers, right, the number of people that are spending time in esoteric forums or deep into weird Reddit subchannels, right, subreddits, far exceeds the total number of people on the internet when I was growing up, right? The raw numbers are insane. But of course, these are not the logics of the mainstream. And so we have to think through what we're studying and what we're talking about in terms of scale. But part of it is also the shift of the stories we tell ourselves around what the internet is. There was a time the internet was imagined as this idyllic home of the mind with a global social space. John Perry Barlow drumbeat this narrative into the World Economic Forum, right? As a way of imagining an act of resistance. They imagined and he mocked the idea of the governments of the industrial world in their home turf. And the internet he imagined the Silicon Valley was creating, to be independent of the tyrannies of governments is now just ridiculous to think about. Because as we've increasingly seen, powerful actors have found plenty of methods of enforcement that we have true reason to fear. Right? So all of what he hoped and dreamed and tried to drumbeat into being is ridiculous to look at right now, but it was something that we imagined with hope of that point. Now, I am not nostalgic for what was. The internet I knew growing up was actually filled with countless problems. My teen years were very much shaped by various forms of digital harassment and abuse. And I, of course, watched teenagers struggle with the good, bad, and ugly of all sorts of online interactions. So I'm not nostalgic for this past, but I am nostalgic for an alternate future, for what could have been and what would have been different had we just had different changes. Not because we know what would have been, but because there are many paths in front of us. All right, the present. The internet of today is a hell zone, right? It didn't have to be. As scholars, we can do the forensics, and many of us are, to understand how a series of actions and decisions, choices and policies, economic forces, and very powerful actors helped get us to this moment. And I think that work is really important. But let us also be careful, because as we tell these stories, we make a lot of causal leaps because of what we see in the present, and we assume a very obvious path and a past that will allow us to make these links. But today's internet is not simply the extension of greed or malevolence. Today's internet is not simply the extension of a military past. Are all of these things relevant and important? Absolutely. But we have to resist the desire to have simplified narratives of how the past has shaped the future. Because there's also many things about the past that are actually part of how we got here, but not part of the ways in which we demonize it in different ways. We'll come there. I often think about how, classic sort of aphorism, right? The road to hell is paved with good intentions. And I think about this a lot because I made personally a whole slew of well-intended interventions into a bunch of different technologies for which I go, shit, right? Like that was not what we imagined. And while we can see those things now and we can sort of look at things like the infinite scroll and being like, what were we thinking? There were reasons we got there. And we have to recognize not just the malevolent pasts, but all of the people who were making reasonable, well thought through, well-intended decisions who helped produce this toxic dumpster fire that we're living with. Because we have to understand the past in its context, not because that is just an intellectual project, but if we want to make interventions around our technological world that actually shape the future, we have to recognize how our intentions in the present may produce unintended consequences of the future. And we need to be clear-eyed about what's unfolding and how we've got there, rather than doing these quick deterministic logics. We are living through another inflection point, right? Plenty of people realize this. But one of the ironies of our AI present is how much of it was created by exploiting the collectivist dreams, particularly the collectivist dreams of an open web, right? Consider, for example, the development of GitHub Copilot, an LLM that was trained on GitHub. GitHub was imagined as a product of open source streams, as ways of actually connecting people and giving gifts in the world of software development. And while big companies eventually exploited open source in a whole slew of different ways, those who drove the movement of open source weren't in it to help make Meta compete with Google, right? They were true believers that open source would be a tool of empowerment, that they would help us collectively produce an infrastructure that was more than the sum of its parts. So how do we reconcile those two stories? And one of the places we can see it is actually thinking about different aspects of Stack Overflow. Like GitHub Copilot, Claude Code was trained on Stack Overflow. Most of the LLMs at this point were. And Stack Overflow was in many ways the best of what we imagined to be open web. You could go there, you could ask questions, people would respond and give you really great software answers. You watched elders within the software engineering world try to raise up the next generation. You watched the supportive network of people who were giving and gifting and learning from one another, even when they were themselves working for all sorts of corporations. And so it's really interesting to think about what those conversations look like and what the purposes of them were, because it was the anathema of late-stage capitalism. And it worked for a while. But one of the things that's interesting is what starts to tear it apart, right? Economics start to tear it apart. It was not just AI. AI was the death knell, right? But one of the things that's so frustrating is that this was a gift economy, one that actually existed in a powerful way for so many people. But no one who was gifting their own advice and their code to the community was imagining that all of their work would be hovered up by an AI to replace them. Right? So how do we reckon with both of those? AI capitalized and exploited the Web 2.0 era of user-generated content. And we can critique what it means to have user-generated content and all the problems with that term. Trust me, I went to many conferences 15 years ago where we debated this incessantly. But the thing is that LLMs of today probably wouldn't have existed without that ecosystem of bloggers, of people sharing on Wikipedia, of people creating all sorts of digital traces because they imagined a different internet future. And so we must recognize the different motives that people have for participating in these ecosystems and the different truths that they have about what they are doing, what they were doing, what they're trying to do, et cetera. Because we have to hold on to all of the ways in which these systems have come into being. So as we think about the history of the internet, we must grapple with its many layers of entanglements. We are dealing with infrastructures, and those infrastructures that have been built over more than 25 years are far more precarious than most of us tend to recognize. I keep reflecting on a dual set of images that have a lot in common. In this one, which is usually called Dependency, was an XKCD comic by Randall Munroe, published in August of 2020. And he brought to light the idea that all modern infrastructure, right, I don't have a pointer, is like, built on these things that we don't pay attention to. By the way, the internet has spent a lot of time to try to figure out what that dude in Nebraska was doing because nobody can quite pin it down. If you want to have a field day, explain XKCD is great. But for those who don't know, XKCD is a comic. This is a pretty standard style for them. And then you mouse over and you get another message. And in this case, the message was someday image magic will finally break for good. And we'll have a long period of scrambling as we try to reassemble civilization from the rubble. I'm curious, how many of you know what image magic is? More than I expected, right? Because this is this really dumb little piece of technology that is so wonderful that just allows you to make certain that you can actually save files across different image files, different ways of transferring from like a GIF to a PNG or to a TIFF, et cetera. And it's one of those things that also allows us to resize an image on the web without thinking about it. It's like one small little piece. And while it was actually created in 1990, so it's not our Nebraska story, it's still a very important piece to the story. All right, let's fast forward, because an anonymous person on Reddit then went and made this. Right? And modern infrastructure is still there. You can still see it. But there are new dependencies that are created everywhere here. More precarity was built on top of precarious infrastructure. So let's zoom in for a moment, because at the end of the day in this image, everything rests on the shark eating the undersea cable, right? You're like, oh, forgot about that piece. Different forms of you might put in other materials. You might think about cobalt. You might think about copper. You might have a field day. But like sharks, man, sharks. And I'm the Jaws era, so we're like sharks. But companies, of course, are also running around adding chaos to this. And I love the depiction of AI, right? It's the crank that's just going to see how far can we go? How far can we go? What's going to happen? And you're like, ah. And of course, you're here. Right? You're at the tip top of that, and seriously, egads. Because the reason I like this metaphoric image is not because of its precision, but because it's capturing some sort of sentiment. And it forces us to really remember that the systems we take for granted are entangled with and dependent on so many different pieces. Some that we pay attention to, some that we know about, others we've never heard of or never thought about. And we need to think about all of these pieces and how they interact if we want to build an ideal or a dream of a new internet future. But these also force us to think about what problems could occur, right? Where are accidents? And I'm particularly fond of, he gives us a theory of normal accidents. He was trying to figure out how to explain what happened at 3 Mile Island. So 3 Mile Island, for those who don't know, is a nuclear power plant in Pennsylvania, very close to my home. So I grew up with this narrative that had a near nuclear meltdown. And part of what happens is that alarms start going off, buzzers and beeps, and everybody tries to respond, thinking they're responding to the right buzzers and beeps, and everything sort of spirals out of control, and a very messy thing unfolds. HCI, people love to have a field day talking about why the buzzes and beeps were not actually a great set of buzzes and beeps, and we need to design the buzzes and beeps better. But I like Perot's interpretation better, because I think he actually captures something at a structural level that we don't necessarily always attend to when we tell ourselves the HCI story. He argues that really complex socio-technical systems and organizations that support them are often a combination of complexity and tight coupling, where one thing is dependent on another thing is dependent on another thing. And what's so nice about his theory of normal access, I should say, what's not so nice, is that he points out that the more tightly coupled things are and the more complex, the more likely that an accident will occur. And he's not making a deterministic claim. He's just making a probabilistic one, right? All paths lead to hell when you actually constrain a system so tightly. But one of the things that's so powerful about how he lays this out is he gives it as a warning and an opportunity. He flags that you can actually make systems more resilient by attending to these matters, by thinking about redundancy, thinking about those entanglements and being thoughtful about how the handoffs go. You can actually make choices around transparency. You can make choices to reduce complexity. You have agency. This is not a dependency, like a determinist story. It is one of full agency. But of course, agency requires attending to that complexity. Now, both STS scholars and legal scholars, I'll give you two of them here, are really interested in the notion of friction. Friction serves many purposes within a complex socio-technical arrangement. Friction slows down a system in order to allow you to see risk so you can take actions to reduce it. It can also be inserted as an act of resistance. And it can simply be present as a very fact of interacting forces. Attending to friction is valuable because frictions have value. They serve purposes. They are worth looking at. And it's important to learn to see them, not because you want to erase them, but because they are so critical for thinking about how systems move and shape and the futures we tell. After all, while the future is not deterministic, frictions and easing functions help configure possibilities and make certain futures more and less likely. So the thing is that our contemporary approach to AI is all about eliminating frictions. This is the dream of efficiency, right? We will move with extraordinary speed into the future, and we will get rid of any friction possible. It's about risking it all. And as we are quickly discovering, the internet's resilience was, by design, its ability to adapt to all sorts of frictions, not its ability to withstand a destabilizing lever capable of identifying and exploiting every vulnerability out there. So how do we sit with tools that are all about eliminating friction and think about the role that friction plays because it is constructive? All right, let's start thinking about the future. How does this set us in motion in a particular way? We are living in a moment where there's a drumbeat about an inevitable future, that the inevitable future is dripping with AI, and if we listen to the pundits, our current internet is being gobbled up and transformed to achieve this AI future. But here's where we get an interesting twist that I've been playing with for the last period of time. I spent a decade studying teenagers and their use of technology in an earlier iteration of the internet. Teenagers were regularly called early adopters, and I grumbled about this because actually in social technologies, early adopters are usually self-identified geeks, freaks, and queers. I was all three, I'm there for it. But it turns out that we like to tell our stories about teenagers, that they get to see around the future, that they're going to tell us what the future of the internet is going to look like. They are the trendsetters for coolness. Their curiosity and creativity and innovativeness still excites adults and makes them afraid. Well, I ended up working with a whole slew of collaborators on a totally adjacent project. Let me shout out to the Project Vibes team because they're pretty amazing. And let me tell you that this was sponsored by the NIH and they don't take credit or acknowledge any of it, whatever. But we went to analyze a totally different project. We wanted to understand some things that were happening unique to the United States around mental health. And in the last minute, I decided to throw some AI questions into both a series of focus groups and a national survey in order to just see if we can get some flavor of what's going on. And we decided to do this with teenagers in the US, ages 12 to 15. Okay, so we'll put some caveats there. And we started trying to make sense of how things were looking and how we could tell our story around mental health and then AI on the side. But I couldn't resist looking at the AI data. And when I did, I was like, oh boy, we are in for some really interesting moments. Because I'm going to give you the focus group data. We do not have the survey data in a state that's going. This is my first public presentation of these data. Again, kudos to my collaborators who are huge and a key part of this. But let's talk about it. Most of my friends that use ChatGPT at all just use it to help with cheat on homework, but all my friends share my negative opinion of it. I avoid people that talk at AI about their feelings because I think that's deeply cringe. I'm really anti-AI. People have been using it to cheat their way through school, and I hate it. I refuse to use it, and I hate not being able to just cheat. Okay. What's going on here? I'm giving you 2 sample quotes, but the dominant narrative in these data are that, of course we use it to cheat in school because school is stupid. That's teenagers going to teenage for you, right? So we're not avoiding these technologies. We're acutely aware that they're there when we have a little bit of mixed feelings about it. We're feeling conflicted. Let's go deeper about how they're conflicted feelings about it. I feel uncomfortable talking to something that doesn't have feelings. It's not real. It doesn't have empathy. And also, if I did, I would feel embarrassed. Like, why can't I talk to a real person? Am I so sad I turn to a robot? My friends are extremely AI. I shamefully use AI in secret. I've mostly stopped, but sometimes I feel like I have no one to confide in. I hate how I use ChatGPT. I use it to help me understand concepts and as an outlet for my feelings, because people around me don't really believe me when I tell them I feel depressed, suicidal, or anything of the gist. I have used it to document my feelings, like when I swap up on people and help me figure out why I am doing that because I'm unable to get a psychologist or therapist. So here again, and I will say our qualitative data in this focus group have very similar frequencies to the national representative data that's already been published in terms of rates of use. But we're getting a much notable texture here. We're getting a story not about AI, but about a set of systems that are not working for these young people, who feel like they don't have the ability to turn to people that will support them, who are using these tools and they're not sure that they like them and they're not sure how they feel about them. So how do we start sitting with this? And they have reasons, of course, about why they don't like it. Because all of my friends equally hate generative AI as much as I do. I don't use them because generative AI is killing the planet as well as plagiarizing from already underpaid artists and is a net negative for us. No, 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 it's pointless, steals from the artists, is horrible for the environment and kills our brains and any thought process a person might have. I'm a big anti-AI. I even have a pin on multiple of my bags that says no AI. Generative AI is horrible. I hate it. It ruins the environment, ruins creativity and how people think. I don't use generative AI because it ruins the environment. It's taking thousands of jobs away from people in creative labor fields. Okay. So again, I'm giving you sample quotes. The thing that's notable is that none of the people in our focus groups were really keen on generative AI. They went from shrug to I really hate this. And they hate it because adults are telling them that this is their future, that this is okay. And they have a sense of justice. They have a sense that this isn't quite right. And they're not up for it. And they don't like what's going on here. Now, the funny thing about this study is that we also included a question about how much your parents are talking to you about your technology use. Right? Because everybody on the planet's like, kids, parents need to talk to their kids about social media. Like that's been a drumbeat for a while. What I was not braced for was how they would respond to this around AI. I disagree with my parents about ChatGPT. I think it is a moral evil. My parents see no problem with it. My parents love ChatGPT and it's kind of scary. They've told me I should adapt to using new tech, but I'm actually the one who is super against it. This makes it hard for us to discuss it. My dad is obsessed with ChatGPT, like he loves the thing and encourages everyone to use it. Like it's to the point that I'll be talking about a lit project and he'll say, just put it into a chat. I've talked to my parents about AI more than they had to me because I understand the negative effects it has on our environment and society. And I explained to them how bad it is and that it's destroying the environment and literacy in the new generations. This is notable, right? They think that their parents have been AI pilled. They think that it's their parents that are a problem in all of this. So let's recap, right? They use Gen AI because they think school's pointless. They use Gen AI because they feel like they have no other options. They think Gen AI is is destroying the environment, jobs, artistry, and their future. And they are baffled with adults' obsession with Gen AI. Now, I want to point out how really notable this is. I have been looking for a long time to find another technology that teenagers use and hate more than their parents. That is weird, right? Not just because of the stories we tell ourselves about early adopters, but because we are so accustomed to a world where adults are afraid of and afraid for their kids when it comes to technology. And here we have a moment where adults are shoving a technology down kids' throats and they're going, what's up with you? Now, how long this lasts, we don't know, but I think it's notable where we start to see it scale up. These are 12 to 15-year-olds, because when we get to older teens, we start to see a new narrative, one that is acutely aware of the power and wealth and money and political economics of this technology, right? I don't know how many of you have watched all the TikTok videos of college graduations and high school graduations in the United States recently, but they're really fascinating because the moment that a commencement speaker mentions AI, the entire audience boos. Think about that, right? It's caught people off guard, and then of course comedians are having a field day with this. But what they're critiquing is not the technology. They're critiquing the project, the political project of AI. The choices that adults are making about what their future possibilities are. And they're asking for a different future. They understand AI is fascinating. They use it. They understand it works as a technology in some ways and not in others. But they don't like the configuration in which this technology is being placed. Because somewhere in their guts, they understand that they're being sold a completely crappy future. That the political economy surrounding Gen AI is corrupt, that they're being enrolled in something that they don't think is right at a moral level, that their parents and other adults in their worlds have been completely deluded. And that's a really interesting starting point to start asking questions about different futures. This isn't simply about convincing them that this AI future is inevitable. It's about asking them what they're going to do about it. Let's reflect. Futures are not inevitable. As internet studies scholars, we need to resist that deterministic thinking. And when I was coming up as a scholar, there was an unhealthy tendency amongst technologists to talk about how the internet would transform the world for the better, right? Critical scholars reasonably responded to this by labeling it technological determinism and constantly critiquing it. However, as all tech became a vehicle for finance, critical scholars started actually taking the same language of the technologists and inverting it. How many times harmed children will spread disinformation, will destroy jobs? That is just as deterministic as the things we were critiquing. And our field is increasingly brought into this and labeled it as the way to be critical. And I think that that's doing ourselves a disservice. Because it's not just that we have embraced the technologically deterministic future that we are actually struggling with. It's that we are actually not allowing ourselves to see the complexity and the multiple voices and the contradictions and the mess. But that's where the interesting questions lie. There is no doubt that we are living through a moment in which unregulated oligarchs are controlling way too much capital and deploying technologies that are designed with undemocratic agendas in mind. That's real. But our critiques of what is happening should not reinforce that inevitability that they are trying to drumbeat into being. As Paul Leonardi and Michelle Jackson have noted, the practice of creating discursive closure, the ability to tell ourselves that this is the future, is very much a tool that powerful actors know how to leverage in order to enroll people towards a future. And so what does it mean when our critiques, our deterministic critiques, enroll us into an inevitable AI future? How do we learn to resist that? Because if tech elites are right, AI is going to take over everything, rendering humans unnecessary. Because fear is a tool that powerful actors use intentionally and unintentionally to make sure that people are complicit in their agendas. The key to this is not to double down on fear and offer alternate fears, but to question that very fear, to question the ideologies underneath it. 20 years ago, I found that talking to teenagers helped me make the familiar strange around the internet. I'm humored that the same is becoming true today. A decade ago, I published a book that focused on teens' use of social media in light of a world where adults are afraid of and afraid for young people, where fear-mongering around technology shaped how adults try to control the social lives of teens. One of the messages that I failed to convey, and it's complicated, is that it was not really about the technology. The technology was simply a boundary object. We are dealing with a new set of boundary objects, and teens aren't exactly rejecting AI. They're rejecting the future that adults are telling them is inevitable. They're rejecting the political economy that they're told they must accept to adults. They're reminding us that they have agency in configuring the future. And to honor them, we need to reject any tendency to slip analytically into the determinism that they are challenging us to reject. We need to understand the complexities of the present, the nuances and messes of the past. We need to see the normal accidents in front of us where we have power to introduce frictions and help create possibilities for diverse futures. And we owe it to the next generation to do so. Thank you.
Once again, a lot to think about, a lot to process, and I'm keen for anyone to take another pop at determinism. I mean, it really is key for us here if we want to have a sense of our own agency in this process. We're not merely passive recipients, especially here as an academic institute dedicating to understanding the future. So questions are a bit light on the Q&A. You are welcome to post any questions in there, but in the meantime, we do have a mic going around the audience, and we'd love to take some questions from it.
There's one down here. And we can go in any direction. We don't have to stay on topic. Lots of places we can have fun with.
Hi, thank you very much for a very inspiring lecture. I'm wondering, what can we do about that apparently inevitable future? Will internet regulation help?
So, internet regulation in general is one kind of friction. I think one of the mistakes that I have seen, and Maria and Angel and I have a paper about techno-legal solutionism, because actually the law often is as deterministic, regulation is often as deterministic as the tech industry. And that once I put this law in, we will get this outcome. And you're like, no. So the thing is that I think regulation is extremely valuable. I think it introduces friction. I think it introduces new possibilities. But I don't think it guarantees us a future. And so I think that part of what we have to do when we think about regulation and the role of regulation is how does it push us and nudge us into different directions? How can we evaluate the efficacy of it? The other thing that I think is really important when we think about regulation is to think about, what's the right layer of the stack that we are regulating. And so much of the conversation about regulating tech is like, if I just fix this one feature, we're going to have all the problems solved. I'm like, no, wrong layer, because of course that's easy to work around. I'm very interested in the long-term impacts of the EU Digital Markets Act, however, right? What does it mean to rearrange the financial conditions? Now, the challenge, of course, is that we've got geopolitical battles underway in versions of this. So a lot of what we're thinking about and dealing with it, we have to deal with at a global level when our regulations are very much at a national level or a local level. But there are places where nations get to have a lot more power, and the question is how to empower them to have a lot more power. The most obvious of which is when we're talking about actual physical resources that can only be found in certain places. And so this is another area we can think about what it means to navigate the finance, and we can think about what it means to navigate the material objects that are happening there. Of course, the US is going to play some questionable games of anybody that tries to get in the way of its companies. We've been there before. The US has a long history of staging coups when people get in the way of its business interests. And so we actually have to reckon with how those pieces are going to fit together. So I say all of that because I don't want people to sit there and be like, magic fairy wand, let's do regulation. It's much more like, how do we see it as a set of moving pieces where it's one piece of that puzzle? The other forms of this look a lot more local as well, right? What does it mean to rise up and challenge what is allowed or not allowed in different environments, right? I am fascinated right now, and I'm curious what we're going to see next academic year by the booing from college students. Because what does it look like when a bunch of college students hold their university accountable for the environmental damage that's being done? That'll get curious. That'll get interesting. Who's mobilizing that kind of activity, that kind of galvanizing? And we're not quite there yet, but I suspect we will get there. And I think that the environment is a key part of that story, which also means as researchers, finding different ways of doing environmental accounting is going to be a critical part of what we can contribute to that movement as people start to reckon with that in different ways. So I want to also point out that the dynamics of resistance don't have to be just at the macro level. There's a lot of micro agency that starts to happen in different ways. And we start to get a new kind of political formation. And so the other question for me of these 12 to 15-year-olds is like, are they going to shift into a world where they're like, oh, now we love it? Are they going to keep hating on it? I mean, the best way to guarantee that they'll keep hating on it is adults keeping telling them that it's the best thing ever, right? Like teenage. But it's sort of an interesting thing about those elements and who mobilizes those energies and what does it look like. So just think about it up and down. There's not one path forward. There's things that each one of us can do in different ways.
So there's a question online here, kind of related to that environmental stuff you were mentioning here, and this is from Jennifer. So what are some of the ways you've seen teens resisting AI? And then she continues. I know there's a lot of youth climate change litigation and policy advocacy. Have you seen something similar for AI, or do you anticipate that there will be?
So let's be clear that that the environmental litigation from young people, it took a decade, right? Plus, right? We started to see different movements, different places. So are we seeing something now that is at that macro scale? No, not yet. Is it quite possible they will? Quite possibly, especially once we burst this psychotic bubble. And the costs and consequences of that become so huge for them in a material way. I think that the things that I'm seeing in terms of their resistance are them outright just refusing to use it, right? Like there's just a basic refusal in a way that I think is really interesting to interrogate, especially as they're under pressure to use it. And so I'm curious what that is going to look like. Again, also as we start actually paying the costs of our Gen AI use, because none of us are paying the costs right now, and young people are not going to be signing up to spend whatever $10 a token. That ain't happening, right? So what does it actually start to look like when the economics come crashing into it? I think we'll see even more refusal, and refusal is a political move, right? Refusal is a way of challenging, and it can coordinate in interesting ways. We are watching coordination of refusal around social media, that's for sure, from young people. We are watching young people rise up in the US and challenge the presence of Chromebooks in their schools. So we are starting to watch these different kinds of formations. They're not going to necessarily happen at speed, but if we know anything about the history of activism, things are slow until they're fast. Right? And so how do we pay attention to and think about what those slownesses are and those elements as they sort of move forward? But I suspect there will be some really interesting, messy things. My hope is that it won't be too violent. And I was, in the Bay Area when a change in the YouTube algorithm upset an influencer enough that he showed up with a gun. How do we deal with that, right? So this is, what are our different kinds of, and what are the backlashes to that? That's always part of the, political project challenge.
I mean, it's already happened at Sam Altman's doorstep as well, in its own way.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I spent a lot of time working with the FBI on my census project, and which is the US's UK Home Office type thing, and I'm always fascinated by all of the things that we don't know, right? And I didn't think I needed to know all of the things that they stop. But as we make them dysfunctional, we'll start to learn all the things that they fail to stop.
Indeed. Another question from the audience. We have one in the back there. Helen, I see.
Thank you. I really liked your talk. And one of the things I really liked is the way you talked about the early days of the internet, and you talked about the thing that people liked. I wrote it down somewhere, but I can't find it exactly, but was the connection. Because so the internet and social media, for whatever came later, they connected people, and they kind of drove all kinds of things beginning with C, like collaboration and crowdsourcing and collective action. And I've been thinking a lot recently about the relationship between AI and democracy, and trying to think about it, how it could be a positive thing. But one of the big challenges is that AI disconnects people, or at least large language models disconnect people. They kind of atomize them. They put them in isolated, kind of individualized environments. And they disconnect information. I mean, in the very early days of the Oxford Internet Institute, we had Ted Nelson here. And you know, I'm sure you're familiar with his vision of Xanadu. For anybody who doesn't know, it was a vision of the internet where every piece of information was connected to every other piece of information. He was very upset that Tim Berners-Lee version had taken off and not his, and it meant we couldn't invite Tim Berners-Lee to speak here the entire 5 years that Ted was here. But I mean, you know, when you look back at that, and I've watched some of the old videos recently, you know, it really is that idea of connection was so important to that vision. And I wondered if you had any thoughts about that, because as a political scientist, it kind of worries me, the idea of disconnection, of all the different ways, and there are quite a few that AI might disconnect us. And do you see any sort of hope in the future about connection could take place, or would there be some reinvention of social media or something like that? Where would we get the connection back?
Interesting to think through is that there were different kinds of connections that happened in different eras with different structures, right? So much of the early days were strangers connecting over shared interests or shared possibilities. They still do, even more than they did back then in terms of raw numbers. It's just that practice never went mainstream. So we still have unbelievable connective tissue around folks that are trying to, you know, connect over whatever hobby they have. It's just that we don't recognize it or pay attention to it because we think it's happening on social media, and it's not happening on social media, right? It's happening in Discord channels. It's happening in Reddit. It's happening, you know, in all sorts of signal groups that are popping up, or WhatsApp groups, or whatever, Telegram groups, depending on what geography you're in. There is a lot going on that is still so we saw in the 90s. It's just never went mainstream. The next kind of connection that we saw, which is really what I tracked, was a connection that was actually about extending existing relationships and managing and negotiating and playing with them in all sorts of different ways using social media. The teenagers I studied overwhelmingly talked with their friends from school and camp, right? Like, they didn't talk to strangers. For all the fear-mongering we had about it, they were just talking to their friends. It's also one of the reasons why our bullying data was so wrong. Because the thing is that we tell our stories of these really extreme cases of bullying by a stranger. But our bullying that was happening online was overwhelmingly of already existing peer relationships, which ironically, we got a amazing natural experiment, right? Because nobody in their wildest imaginations would have said, dear teenagers, never go to school and spend all day on the internet, right? Except we spent a while doing that. It was called the pandemic. And you know what was interesting about the bullying data? Fell through the floor. Because the bullying online for most teenagers was the interpersonal conflict of the schools. And so in the United States, where we're allowed to homeschool, the number of kids who were like, can I never go back again? Like, this is great. I can learn if I don't actually have to deal with this toxicness of the schools. The connections of other populations also, I give you the teens. The challenge is more interesting when we start to look at the adult population. The adult population, for a variety of interesting reasons, has actually been purposely disconnecting from opportunities and thinking about different ways of what it means to think about friendship. And we can blame different forces about what it means to, to actually have shifted our politics such that women in a heterosexual environment get to go to work. Because that actually played a pretty significant role in changing the dynamics of relationship management in a community. all the ways in which we have certain kinds of relationships at work, and what we maintain and what we don't maintain, those have all these different changes. Our relationship to religious institutions, huge changes. So there's a bunch of different forces at play that had nothing to do with technology for a lot of different adults. And many adults turned to the internet hoping that that would make it up for them. And some of them really it did, right? There's entire communities of what we used to call mommy bloggers, like forward into our influencer culture. There's entire worlds that have popped up and felt connected. But there's other places where it's not working for people. And so what's really interesting to me, and this is part of where, the mental health piece of the data that we're looking at is some of these network connections. But it's interesting to me to see where it's re-popping up. Now, I'm an American, I study the US. I am not going to try to speak to the UK, but one of the most fascinating dynamics in the US has actually been the Trump rallies. Why? Because it turns out that people drive from miles and miles away to not attend the actual rally, but just to sit in the parking lot and meet and connect and drink beers and have fun. And it's funny because how many people go in from the parking lot and they go into the rally, and Trump is notorious. He shows up 3 to 4 hours late. He's never really engaged. It's a whole thing. And the thing is that they spend that whole time getting to know each other because of community building that we're seeing, but we wouldn't label it as such. And it made me think actually about John Parley Barlow, because I did an interview with him years and years and years ago, where he talked about how the Grateful Dead allocated tickets. And so for those who don't know, there was like a world before Ticketmaster or whatever you guys used to buy your tickets, where you actually just contacted a person who would send you the ticket, right? That's kind of weird. And with the Grateful Dead, that was how you got your tickets. You wrote to this one lady. But she kept a database, otherwise known as a lot of index cards, over every show you've ever been to. And she sat you at the next show based on where you were seated in the previous show. So you went to the Miami show and you were like in whatever section, and then you write in and you want to go to the Nashville show. She puts you by those same people that were at the Miami show with you. By the second or third one, you're like, dude, you're here. This is like best friends ever, right? Classic Milgram. And the result was a really crazy phenomenon. So for those who don't know Deadheads, this is like where older people like got really obsessed and like went city to city to city to city, like listening to really terrible music, but because of the community building. So I say that because I think there's a lot we can do about community building. I think we need to acknowledge it, but when we center tech in the equation, we make too many deterministic claims about what it is and isn't doing. Most of the AI use that I'm watching in terms of it, it's like, it's not community or not community. Some of it is culture, right? I will produce this ridiculous song using a Gen AI model, and then I will share it with my friend, right? That is actually connective tissue, because you sit there and laugh at the ridiculous song. That's our history of how we use media. We are also seeing people being like, look things up, right? And share it with each other. They're looking around together. I mean, the number of ridiculous Gen AI apps where you watch people standing around and being like, oh my God, get it to do that. Make it look this way. Oh, especially image generation, right? They have fun with it. The thing is that what the connection is the people standing around the phone, not inside the AI model. And so I'm not convinced that AI connects or disconnects. My feeling is that AI is a tool that's playing many different roles, and depending on how you define it, it's all the things anyhow. There's many different roles, and the question is, what is getting in the way of people finding connection? So when I point out these teenagers saying like, we can't get access to therapists, that's notable. Because we drumbeat that long enough, and therapy will become something you don't even seek. So how do we also deal with the fact that people are turning to it as an outlet? And so much of my teen work was young people who were desperate to socialize in person and weren't allowed. And they used it as an outlet. So how do we deal with the fact that we're probably going through another rev of this? And maybe the answer is not about the technology, but maybe the answer is we have to grapple with why we've constrained people so much. And how do we open that back up? How do we address the fears that we have drumbeat, that kids think that their neighbors are potential pedophiles, right? Because that's deadly for social fabrics.
So I think for the last question online, and then we'll have one more from the room, I want to it's from Bill Thompson, who's part of our advisory board, works at the works at the Beeb, couldn't make it here, but he wanted you to elaborate a little more on parasocial, and I really hear parasocial lurking in the background of that last comment. So if we could get a short comment on that.
Yeah. So I published a snarky essay on social media and society for an anniversary edition of there, and what I was really interested in is a long-term concept that comes from media studies of parasociality, right? Which is the idea that I can follow you and track everything you're doing, but you don't know I exist, right? Or vice versa, right? So like, think about it in terms of old media, right? Like kids who knew everything about the Beatles, right? And they were the biggest fans ever. And they loved them and they could tell you details of their birth dates and who they're dating and blah, blah, blah. We've seen that in media with celebrity studies for a very long time. And the thing is that the internet, the social media that I studied was not originally parasocial. Yes, there was Tila Tequila, right? There were people that were off there doing weird shit. But I was telling Bernie, I remember, this group of young people I was hanging out with during those early days who were absolutely convinced MySpace was a Christian site because their entire world on there was Jesus quotes. And I was like, wow, right? Like they'd never encountered Tila Tequila, right? Who, for those who don't know, she's unique. You can search her. And so the thing is, I say about this because now, if you talk to young people about who they follow, it's all like following the big celebrities. It's just the influencers, right? And there's different versions of it, and they're living in these different fragmented worlds where they're following these influencers. The influencers don't know they exist. Why does that matter? When it comes to social support, friends they're the ones that are there for you. Parasociality, they're not going to show up for you, right? Or not in the ways that you might think. And the consequences can be genuinely deadly. So a project that I never published was that I looked after the It Gets Better campaign, which is when Dan Savage sort of encouraged all these celebrities to post videos about like being gay and mostly gay and how it gets better if you just wait. And young people were like, oh, is this how I actually make connection? I will post a video of myself to YouTube about how I'm gay. They didn't get support from Dan Savage or all the other celebrities. They thought they were joining a network and a community. What they got was being tortured by their peers. And for the better part of a year, I tracked a bunch of young people who died by suicide who had made these videos. So this is where parasociality can be really costly. The nice thing about today is that they know they're following celebrities that are strangers. And actually, it's the adults that are less healthy about their parasociality. But parasocial media is of a very different kind than the things that allow us to meaningfully connect. And so that's one of the reasons my call is that if we're going to be tracking influencers, let's stop calling it social media. Because yes, people socialize by referencing the media of the celebrity, but they are not building the same sociality as what we were studying when we began this.
All right, and perhaps the last one from the room here.
Then we get drinks, right?
Yeah, then it's drinks.
Talk.
Sorry about the others.
Yes, thank you for giving this lecture. Again, your perspective was very interesting to hear. Early in the lecture, you did mention a nostalgic feeling for what the internet could have been. Do you think that because the internet is a form of communication, it's inevitable that it became a tool to make money? If so, how would it have been possible to prevent exploitation for profit? And if not, how would one stop people from using it for that purpose?
Yeah. So I really underestimated the consequences of the deregulation moves in the 1980s in the US. And they came in many different forms. There's deregulation of media. There's also deregulation of different ways of organizing companies. And so it was interesting to me because like the place where I started to put it all together was actually what happened to the news media industry, which was the warning sign that we didn't pay attention to. Most people think that the news media will in the US by the internet, but that's actually not true. After dereg, what happened was that financiers, primarily private equity and hedge funds, bought up all of these news organizations. Why? They had a very important asset. That important asset was their physical building in the middle of the town as we were moving towards what would become a housing bubble. They bought it, they extracted the housing unit extracted the building from it, either renovated it or destroyed it and put up a new building. And then they had the news organization pay rents. And they created the condition where the news organizations would pay rents to the point where they could no longer actually function as business. Because it turns out that media businesses are not return on investment profitable. And then, of course, they could actually extract the asset. They would throw down the asset and make a lot of money off of that. And what was really interesting to me is not just that they did that, but that they convinced everybody that it was the internet that killed the news media. I'm like, that's a really interesting dynamic. Like, how did we get there? And there's some really great, amazing scholars who have sort of unpacked that. But I think it's a really interesting tell of what we were coming. And we can see it in the ways in which the post-dot-com bust restructured their ownership of businesses. So, for example, we often talk about how Mark Zuckerberg owns a ridiculous amount of Meta. And that really is a response to a world where this was about taking over, all of this activist takeovers of corporations that occurred in the aftermath of dereg. And the thing is that we're going through it again. We've got a lot of activist investors, which means that if you don't have complete control over your business, the likelihood it will be taken away from you in order to make it assetized is really real. And so one of the things that I think we need to grapple with is the assetization of everything. Keen Birch is doing fantastic work. There's a bunch of other people doing great work in this. But it is an assetization dynamic that is not about a particular internet technology, but about a way of actually trying to control capital. And it's about assetization, extraction, and separation. And so it's like, SpaceX is not a internet company per se, although we can discuss how much it's trying to be an AI company. But SpaceX is a fully assetized business. And that is actually what makes that IPO bloody insane. And so one of the things that I would say is that for me, it's like, how do we deal with these dual moves? Because it happened to be that the internet technologies that we were dealing with came at the same time as the assetization move of all of these different financiers. They happened to align, but it could have been many other technologies that would have been assetized. It could have been many other pieces. It's just that was what temporally aligned. In the same way that we are watching for all sorts of interesting historical reasons, undemocratic moves around the globe, and it happens to coincide with AI. So it becomes a tool of these futures rather than the thing that is going to be the cause of it. And so I think part of it analytically is we have to understand how these different perfect storms come out and how one uses the other to cover the various goals. And my favorite scholar that I often go back to on this is I often spend a lot of time thinking with Manuel Castells, and how he and many of his students have actually just understood the coordination and use of networks. And he's insidiously infuriating because remember, it's networking, and network making power. But the point is that the ability to make networks is how power can actually operate. And what we have seen is a big turn of a lot of people figuring out how to do this. And we haven't figured out, we've watched how people who make networks can destroy other networks that have long existed. But we are not seeing a challenge to a lot of those network making projects at this moment. So I think of it that way. It's like, how do we think about the assetization and the financialization? How do we think about the network making and the capitalization? All of these things are coming together. And so when I want to calm down, I read Anna Singh, who is just a good reminder that, there is a world after late stage capitalism. And with that, let's go get a drink.
Dana, thank you so much.